Good evening. Welcome to Boston College. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you tonight in the name of the Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry and the Church in the 21st Century Center, who are co-sponsors of our gathering tonight. This evening, Father J. Brian Hare of the Archdiocese of Boston will deliver the inaugural public lecture of the Institute's 2006-2007 Continuing Education series. The theme of this year's series is Reading the Signs of the Times. Decades ago, Pope John XXIII urged that the Church be alert to the signs of the times and ready to interpret the present day in the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Second Vatican Council's Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, promulgated almost 41 years ago now, saw the Council as seeking one solitary goal, quote, to carry forward the work of Christ under the lead of the befriending Spirit. And Christ entered this world to give witness to the truth, to rescue and not to sit in judgment, to serve and not to be served, end quote. Reading the signs of each age, the Conciliar document states, includes the call to respond in language intelligible to each generation to the perennial questions which men and women ask about this present life and the life to come, and about the relationship of the one to the other. We must therefore recognize and understand the world in which we live, its expectations, its longings. Our speaker this evening is uniquely well equipped to help us answer this call. Father Brian Hare serves presently as the Secretary for Social Services and the President of Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Boston. He is currently the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Kennedy School of Government of Harvard University. He previously was a faculty member of Harvard Divinity School and chair of its executive committee. During those years, he was also the pastor of St. Paul's Parish in Cambridge. Father Hare was the president of Catholic Charities USA and worked for some 20 years at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C., while teaching at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and St. John's Seminary across the street here in Brighton. He's a well-published author and a respected voice nationally and beyond on issues of ethics, foreign policy, international relations, Catholic social ethics, and the role of religion in world politics and in American society. The recipient of numerous honors and more than 25 honorary degrees, Catholic Charities USA described Father Hare as a long-heard, clear, and respected voice in the Catholic Church when they presented him with their 2004 Vision Award. When he was commissioned as president of Catholic Charities USA, Father Hare listed the foundation stones on which the Catholic commitment to social ministry stands: to serve all, to be inclusive, to maintain our Catholic identity, to collaborate with and critique the state on behalf of those in need. These are the kind of choices, he continued that day, that serve as the foundation for the future. This evening, we are so fortunate to have this clear, respected voice with us to speak to us on the social ministry of the Church from John Paul II to Benedict XVI. Welcome, Father Hare.
Thank you very much, John. I very much appreciate the invitation to come and be with the Institute of Pastoral Ministry. I've had opportunity to teach in it in the past, and that was an experience I enjoyed a great deal. And I also particularly am honored to be asked for a second time to participate in the Church in the 21st century. I think it is important to congratulate Father Leahy and Boston College and the administration of Boston College for that initiative. I think it has been enormously helpful to the Archdiocese of Boston, the Church in Boston, and the general cultural understanding of faith and reason in this community. So I am grateful to be part, again, of this program. I have made a choice of a topic that is a topic that might be described as imbalanced. The topic of the transition from John Paul II to Benedict XVI has been analyzed from many perspectives. I am only going to look at one segment of that question, namely the social ministry as it stands between the two of them. But it is imbalanced because obviously a pontificate of 25 years and perhaps the most activist papacy in 1,000 years stands over against a papacy that is barely in its beginning stages. So there is a way in which one could ask, why are you doing this? And my answer is, I don't think we ought to forget the past too quickly. And secondly, it is still necessary to probe the present to get a sense of what the future may hold for us. So what I will do is to move first to an examination of what I'll call the social legacy of John Paul II. I then will turn secondly to what I'll call the social question as it confronts Benedict XVI. And then I'd like to say some final things about the implications of both of their pontificates for the life of the Church and its social ministry here in the United States. The social legacy of John Paul II, obviously a topic that would take a course in itself. But my point is to make a proposition at the outset here, and that is that we should not too quickly consign the social ministry of this Pope to what I might call the papal past. That is to say, one reference point among others. I think there is a usable future in much of the social teaching of John Paul II, and I think it is important to remember what that resource is and to ask how it might continue to be used even in light of, obviously, a papacy that we have before us in the form of Benedict XVI. To make my argument about the legacy, I will say a word first about the social context that John Paul II faced when he became Pope. Secondly, what he said. Thirdly, what he did. And fourthly, how he led. The context, what Gaudium et Spes calls the signs of the times, and John the 23rd called the signs of the times. What were the dominant characteristics of the context that John Paul II faced when he was elected in 1978? The dominant reality, of course, was the Cold War. It was alive and very well at the time that he became Pope, and it shaped the larger international setting, most directly in terms of the superpowers and Europe, but the consequences of the Cold War ran literally across the globe. And John Paul II confronted both the central tension of the Cold War and its consequences in places that were at the edge of international politics. That was the first reality. The second reality is what I will call the journey from interdependence to globalization. It had just begun in 1978 in this sense that in the late 60s, political scientists began to talk about the interdependence of the economies of sovereign states and the way in which there were ties, particularly economic ties, that cut across sovereign independent states and bound together their peoples and their fate and future. But what was described as interdependence in the late 60s, by the time John Paul II died, was a qualitatively different reality. The journey from interdependence to globalization as the context of the political economy of the globe is a journey that manifests not simply incremental change, but qualitative change. John Paul II also walked that journey. Thirdly, when he became Pope in 1978, It was a period of time, it was the decade really of the 1970s, in which human rights emerged as a central idea in world politics and domestic politics. And human rights for John Paul II became a major part of how he addressed the world and called the church to address the world. So the Cold War in political military terms, the journey from interdependence to globalization in international political economy, and the fact of human rights as part of the fabric of both life within states and across states were there as the setting, not the total setting, but a major part of the setting of the world that John Paul II confronted. Now, what did he say? Well, here one has to look at the social corpus of John Paul II as a whole, because we obviously do not have time to look at it in detail. There are usually three texts that are regarded as the social teaching of John Paul II. First, his encyclical on work, Laborum Exercens, in 1981. Second, his encyclical on development in the developing countries, primarily Solicitudo Rei Socialis in 1987, and then Centesimus Annus, the 100th anniversary document of Rerum XIII, of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. These three texts are usually described as the social teaching of John Paul II. I must say that my own view of this is that it is very difficult to separate out these three texts and leave the rest of his teaching as not being the social teaching. Or to put it another way, he had a fabric of teaching the Christian faith that was social from beginning to end. And so while these three texts can classify as, quote, social encyclicals, his first encyclical on Redemptor Hominis in 1979 immediately plunged him into a discussion about the international financial institutions. His encyclical in the 1990s on Evangelium Vitae tried to demonstrate that questions like bioethics were social to the core, that you couldn't interpret them as simply questions of individual choices. So his texts were broader than the social text. Secondly, in addition to text, you had to, of course, take into consideration the travels and the discourses on the trips. Now, scholars of the teaching authority have rightly pointed out that these discourses in individual countries don't hold the same weight as when the Pope teaches the Church as a whole, but they are part of the raw material that I hope is preserved. Because when John Paul II went into a multiplicity of countries and examined the social question in terms of the fabric of these countries, he said things that are quite usable today. Finally, there is the worldview that comes through this teaching of John Paul II, the corpus as a whole. And if I tried to play out that teaching in detail, I would take three moments in his teaching. First, his opening address to the United Nations in 1979. Secondly, his return address to the United Nations in 1995. And then thirdly, the text Centesimus Annus in 1991. These three, in a sense, to my mind, provide a sense of the descriptive view of the globe that John Paul II had, as well as his moral concerns. Why do I say that? In 1979, when he came to the UN to address the UN in the early stages of his papacy, it was interesting to me that he chose the theme human rights as the dominant theme for his address to the world. If it's possible for someone who studies this teaching to do a critique of it as well as explain it, I always thought that he tried to do too much in that talk. He tried to argue that you could encompass all of international politics through the lens of human rights. And I don't think actually you can do that. There were many other topics that he had to address later that were not included in that lens. But that lens stressed the universal human community, and that human rights was the factor that bound together the human community, both within states and across states. It stressed the universality of our common life together, a first point about his view of the globe. How do we preserve that? Secondly, when he came back in 1995, the stress was laid on a different point. In 1995, while repeating his argument about the importance of human rights, he very interestingly talked about nationalism. Not universality, but particularity, the value of nationalism. Now, nationalism in the 20th century, on the whole, has not been necessarily regarded as a positive topic, because nationalism often stands behind conflicts. But this was a Polish Pope, who remembered that his nationalism was taken away from him, or taken away from his country, 3 different times. And he had a sense of the identity that it gives to people to stress nationalism. So there, he talked about a world that was both universal but had particularities in it. Those particularities are usually embodied in sovereign states. He was back to the units that make up the globe. And then finally, in Centesimus Annus, I'll come back to that, but in Centesimus Annus, what he does is to bring together, if you will, the 2 major dimensions of world politics, political military questions and political economy, and tries to bind them together and provide a moral framework for both of them. Now, this was, I think, his attempt to say this is the kind of world we confront. And now the question becomes, what have we got to say about this world in moral terms or moral religious terms? I will turn in a moment to what he did have to say, but I have one additional point to make, and that is a leitmotif that runs through this speech, namely the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, or the Church in the Modern World. It is commonly understood that this was the document of the Council that he had the most direct impact on and the most direct identification with. It has become a topic of conversation because, as I turn to Benedict XVI, it is not necessarily the case that Benedict XVI found the same things in Gaudium et Spes that John Paul II did. But for John Paul II, it provided the place from which he then addressed this world, global in its universality, distinct in its particularity, bound together by a set of problems that cut across war and peace, political economy, and human rights. And John Paul II drew from this text a way of articulating the Catholic social vision. For most of the 20th century, the Catholic social vision was articulated in the language of reason, in the language of philosophical reason. John Paul II, drawing from Gaudium et Spes, always added a theological reflection to the more precise clinical analysis that you find in the philosophical language of Catholic teaching. That is simply a characteristic of his style. Turn to what he said about the globe. And interestingly enough, in a world marked by the Cold War, globalization, and human rights, he had something to say about each one of them. That is why there is still a usable future in these texts. On human rights, what is interesting, I think, is if you compare John Paul II with John the 23rd. John the 23rd's great text on human rights was Pacem in Terris, and the enormous value of that text was that it bridged the gap, really, between the Catholic natural law conception of human rights and the more secular modern philosophy that emerged out of the 16th to the 18th century. For most of the period of time from the modern era on, there had been a perceived conflict between these 2 different ways of thinking about human rights. And clearly they are not identical. But John the 23rd, in a way that popes only can do, took a topic that we had thought about for 300 years and said, we really have a lot of common ground to share, and he didn't even give you a footnote on why he could change the argument like that. But he did. He drew a systematic linkage between modern conceptions of human rights and Catholic conceptions. That was his great gift. It was a systematic ordering of rights, and it was linking us to a larger argument that we had been somewhat distant from. John Paul II, in his address before the UN, was willing to go to a deeper level of philosophical analysis about how we think about different forms of human rights. This had been the dividing issue in the Cold War, with the Western capitalist countries, democratic in nature, talking about human rights as political and civil, and the socialist countries talking about rights as social and economic. John Paul II sought to provide the foundation of a unified conception of human rights based on the needs of the human person, which are both political and spiritual and material and economic. This was a step beyond John the 23rd. And it's an important step because in this, what I might call the secular world, people interested in human rights oftentimes don't want to touch the philosophical foundation of what undergirds them because they feel it's a never-ending debate. So I think John Paul II, in a sense, has left us something to think about there. Secondly, he turned to the question of war and peace. And here he was guided by Gaudium et Spes. If you look at what he did to the question of war and peace, take three moments in the Catholic tradition: the teaching of Pius XII, the teaching of Vatican II in Gaudium et Spes, and then the teaching of John Paul II. Pius XII was a classical just war thinker who did not acknowledge that any other position on the use of force was legitimate in Catholic circles except the just war argument. Gaudium et Spes opened a new kind of discussion by reaffirming the just war and at the same time arguing that there was space, certainly for Catholics as individuals, to hold a position of nonviolence or absolute pacifism. So you came out of the council with a different framework, if you will. John Paul II took that framework and he pushed it on every side. He advanced the debate established by the framework of Gaudium et Spes. John Paul II did not rule out war as a moral option, but he made its justification much more difficult. In other words, the Catholic argument still allows for some use of force in international affairs, but John Paul II made it more difficult to justify that use of force, and he provided a series of statements that stressed how important it was to find other ways than force to deal with human affairs. We can see the significance of what he did in sort of moving the debate on war and peace forward if we look at the cases he analyzed. In the Middle East, he opposed both Gulf War I and the war in Iraq. Again, if I'm free to comment, I think he was wrong on Gulf War I. I think there were good reasons to use force. I think, in fact, it would have been a mistake not to use force, but he was powerfully committed to the notion that it wasn't necessary at that time. I think he was dead right on Iraq. It's taken most of the country time to come around to that, but he was right from the beginning to the end to oppose it, at least in my view. Moreover, he sought to resist the turn toward violence, not simply in big power politics, but also within countries that were falling apart in many ways, and people resorted to violence as a means of political change. He resisted that argument, and that brought him into conflict with Catholic authors in different parts of the globe, in South Africa, at times in Latin America. But while he resisted the use of force, he never totally banished the idea that in a world in which there is no central authority, there must be some means of using coercive force to prevent massive injustice. So after the massacre at Srebrenica, he said just crisply, there still is room for a just war. And after 9/11 in Afghanistan, while you might argue about the text, as I read it, it said it was justifiable to respond in force. So while supporting Afghanistan, he opposed the war in Iraq. Finally, in the area of international political economy, from his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, where he brought under critique, as I said, the international financial structures of the globe, up through Centesimus Annus, he offered us a series of ideas that, again, I think provide a usable future. Indeed, it was two characteristics of his teaching that are particularly valuable. One, he had a powerful sense of what economists say, that it's almost impossible today to talk about a national economy apart from its tight linkage to a global economy. And he brought a moral analysis to bear on economics globally and nationally, with an emphasis on the global. Secondly, much more so than his predecessors, he acknowledged the value of the market, or the so-called market economy. And the significance of that, I think, was, A, on the one hand, it is so much of a consensual point among economists that to have the church not acknowledge it is very much like hiding your head in the sand. At the same time, what he did was to marry an argument about the value of the market economy to do certain things, to protect human initiative, to provide for a rational allocation of resources, and to provide a sense of freedom and protection from the power of the state. He combined those arguments about the positive aspects of a market economy with clear sense of limits about the market, what it will not do. In essence, his argument was the market may well be efficient. That does not necessarily mean it produces by itself justice. So then you have to move to a framework of policy that allows the market to function and at the same time tries to fill in the gaps, if you will, or the limitations of the market. That was what he said. What he did. With John Paul II, you have to combine words and deeds, because oftentimes what he said was not enough to guide you to what I think he really meant. Take the question of church and politics, and clerics and politics, and religious and politics. He had an adamant position against priests and sisters in politics, and that at times seemed to spill over to an argument that they shouldn't even be terribly active as advocates in the political arena. But if you watched him, my argument always was, I never wanted to be more political than the Pope. As long as I could be as political as the Pope was, I thought we had plenty of room and we had no difficulty with his statements that priests and nuns shouldn't be political. So words and deeds came together with John Paul II. Sam Huntington, in a book on the Catholic Church and democracy in the 1980s, made the point not only that Catholic teaching on human rights, the kind of teaching I've already talked about, was a remarkable shift in world politics, but Huntington also added that in key situations of conflict, John Paul II just happened to show up dressed in papal white and descended on scenes and made a difference not only in themes, but in very specific initiatives within countries. So these kinds of interventions that he carried out were interventions that matched the social teaching with a body of leadership and action. Now, it is important, I think, that he always justified what he was doing in light of Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes' argument is that the Church should not be a political actor. A judgment, I think, is entirely wise. But Gaudium et Spes said the Church should carry out its religious ministry directly in such a way that it had multiple indirect effects. And those indirect effects were how to protect the dignity of the person, how to promote the human rights of the person, how to foster a sense of unity in the human family, and how to provide a sense of meaning to every area of human activity. Once again, to say that the Church ought not to be political is fine with me as long as we can do those four other things. And those four other things were part and parcel of what his ministry was about. Finally, how he led. What kind of church model, if you will, did he promote by what he was? Within the Christian community, it is often set out that there are two broad ways for the church to witness in society. One is to stand over against it, if you will, and the second is to be in the midst of it, recognizing that the identity of the church will never be the same as the identity of secular society, so that there always is a kind of give and take, a kind of standing against and collaborating with. John Paul II, I think, had a bit of both in him, but the dominant model was, I think, the model that said, you enter into the world, you know who you are in the world, you share some ground with the state and other secular actors, but you never share total ground. Now, the reason I say there was a bit of the other model in him is that he would draw lines in absolute terms, his most famous being the culture of life and the culture of death. Again, I myself do not find that distinction as illuminating as many people do. But on the whole, I think even if you use it within a framework of the kind of model of the church that you find in Gaudium et Spes, which I always found fascinating. The title of the document is not the church and the world, it's the church in the world. And the church in the world then must draw its relationships between itself and other major actors in society, keeping its identity clear, but not keeping itself simply over against the world. There's a final point about John Paul II that will then transit to Benedict XVI. If you look at the period from 1978 to his death in 2005, one of the things that happened to the picture of the world that I described, Cold War, globalization, and human rights, one of the things that happened was the rise of religion in the midst of world politics, a topic that was virtually untouched and untouchable as late as the 1970s, simply not addressed in the major study of world politics or the practice of it. By the time he died, religion was a dominant topic in world politics. Some would argue too much of a topic. I do not think you can attribute all of that to him, but I do think he was a catalyst at a time when this topic was emerging. And as it emerged, he both fed it, provided a model of how to deal with it, and at the same time was part of a larger picture, and that picture, if anything, has intensified since his death and the transition to the pontificate of Benedict XVI. So let me turn now to the pontificate of Benedict XVI, the social question as it confronts Benedict XVI. I use the term social question with capital letters, the way it is used in Catholic thought, the social question that emerged in the late 19th century and has become something that the Church in every decade of the last century believed it had to address. So Benedict XVI will also have to address it. And therefore the question is, how does the social question confront him and how does he respond to it? I'd like to use the same categories of the context he faces, what he said, what he did, and how he will lead. The world that faces him, it is less well defined, in a sense, than the world that faced John Paul II. John Paul II's world was dominated by the Cold War. The Cold War was dominated by two great superpowers that structured much of what went on in the world, not everything, but much of it. The balance of power of the Cold War is gone, and there is no clear successor to it. In other words, you could find almost any academic and analyst or diplomatic analyst in the late 1970s could describe the structure of the world for you in a minute. Bipolar, two great powers, nuclear in its content, things spread out from there. Today there is no such consensus on what the structure of power of world politics is. Some argue that we are in a world that is back to a classical empire, and the United States stands in the status of an empire. Others argue that in fact what you have is a mixed pattern of power in the world. If you want to talk about political and military power, there is no power in the world that can rival what the United States spends, what it possesses, or the quality of its military. But we have also come to understand that that kind of power is not automatically translatable into getting things that you want done. Because once again, the power of nationalism, the capacity of insurgents, the existence of non-state actors in the world with the capacity to use force in a way that we thought states could once use it. All of that makes the picture very much less clear than the picture that originally confronted John Paul II. The rise of non-state actors of different kinds litter the globe in a good sense, or are woven through the globe. Many non-state actors are groups that provide humanitarian relief, development, work on human rights, but some non-state actors provide violence, large amounts of violence. My colleague at Harvard, Joe Nye, in looking at the debate on globalization that is constantly talking about privatization of things, Joe says that what Al-Qaeda is the privatization of war, that private groups now have the capacity to do what we thought only states could do. Benedict XVI confronts that world in its empirical reality much more clearly than John Paul II. There is the continuing diversified impact of globalization. By diversified, I mean that it demonstrates an enormous capacity to produce aggregate wealth. It also demonstrates that that aggregate wealth does not benefit all. And so massive inequalities continue in the journey of globalization. And finally, as I have said, whereas religion and world politics were hardly a topic when John Paul II emerged, they are very much now at the center of how we understand the world. A world with multiple powers, with states and non-state actors, a world of extraordinary productivity of aggregate wealth and enormous inequality, a world in which religion and politics are rather inextricably tied together. That is the world, at least large parts of it, that Benedict XVI faces. What has he said? Well, here is where the imbalance comes, because he hasn't said a great deal, but he has said some things. So I will take the two most known texts that he has given us so far, and then recognize that around them fall a series of shorter statements to the diplomatic corps or other things. It is noticeable that he has not tried to make a major statement on world politics. John Paul II did not wait very long on that, but Benedict XVI is a different pope. I might as well move ahead to what I will come to later. I think we face a much less, if I can call it this, political papacy in its consequences in this pope. That is not to say he does not have avenues to affect world politics, but I'll come back to that. His two most well-known statements are his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, and then his speech at Regensburg. Now, behind that lies, as it did for John Paul II, lies the question of what his view of the church in the world is. Again, John Paul II, I think, solidly rooted in Gaudium et Spes. There has been much commentary by several authors that Benedict XVI had difficulty with Gaudium et Spes at the time of the Council and has never been a terribly enthusiastic user of the text since then. What is it that he finds at least unpersuasive or unconvincing about the text? I don't think he finds its ecclesiology primarily unpersuasive. That is to say, the theme of Gaudium et Spes is that the church ought to be an active, engaged church in the world. I don't think that he has a direct difficulty with that notion. I think his difficulty lies more in two other areas of theology. what you might call theological anthropology, the view of the human person, the view of the role of grace and sin in history, and on the other hand, eschatology, that is to say, the relationship of the kingdom of God here and the kingdom of God that lies ahead of us. I think on the whole, Benedict XVI finds Gaudium et Spes a bit too optimistic on both of those counts, a bit too optimistic about its conception of the person, human progress, and how sin and grace are woven together in the world. And secondly, a bit too optimistic about how much of a linkage you can make between the world as it is and the kingdom that we hope someday to enter and know. So it is at that level, at least as I read it, that the differences lie, less in the area of ecclesiology, which I think would be the more difficult problem if he actually thought the ecclesiology of Gaudium et Spes was problematical. Let me turn then to the first text, Deus Caritas Est. As any of you know who have read this document, it really is two distinct large questions which are bound together in one encyclical, in one broad heading discussing the reality of charity in Christian life, that God is love, that God's love has been shared with humanity, and therefore the conception of charity ties us both to God and to one another. Now, under that broad framework, he has a part one in which he discusses the question of human sexuality and marriage and sexuality generally. And then secondly, in the second part of the encyclical, he discusses our human relationships in the political and economic order. The tone of the document, I think, has been rather universally found to be positive. It is a professorial tone, but it is also a pastoral tone. Some have argued that part one is really his, and part two was a text that was being developed for use by John Paul II when he died. But clearly, it is one text with one pope that stands behind it, and both of the topics have been positively commented on in the reception of the encyclical. The dominant reality, I think, is its continuity with Gaudium et Spes, because the Pope says at one point that the work of charity, the work of caring for the needs of others in social terms, should be located along with the Church's worship and teaching. Now that means that you place this work of engagement in the human reality and trying to both enhance the human reality, bind up the wounds of a world that is less than perfect, that is to be lodged near the worship of the Church and the teaching of the Church. And so the importance of that is that that's what I think the dominant message of Gaudium et Spes was. Before Gaudium et Spes, the Church had an articulated moral teaching about how Christian faith was to respond to the world in terms of war and peace, in terms of social justice, etc. What was missing before Gaudium et Spes was the ecclesiological foundation that asserted in clear terms that this work of responding to the needs of the world was not something we did because we had time on our hands. We did it because it was central to what it meant to be Christian, to what it meant to be Catholic. And that ecclesiological grounding from Gaudium et Spes, I think, was the long-term, most significant contribution of the document. I find the Benedict XVI's assertion about the significance of social charity to be a direct linkage with the earlier text. He then turns to the question of the relationship of charity and justice, defining what they are and who is responsible for them in the world. Here it is more complicated, I think, to sort out his position. His treatment of these two tends to distinguish them fairly radically. I think the normal Catholic way of defining them tended to see them as distinct, but in rather direct continuity. Cardinal O'Connor, when he became Pope, oh, no, we didn't quite get there. Cardinal O'Connor, when he became a bishop, took as his motto, where there is no justice, there is no love. That's a paraphrase. And the argument is that you must do justice to others before you can extend yourself in sacrificial charity. So the linkage of these two is tight, as I read it in the traditional statement of it. In the encyclical, they are treated in somewhat distinct fashion, and then the next step is that the Pope tends to distinguish different agents. So the Church becomes the agent of charity, particularly through its institutions, its social institutions, and the state becomes the agent of justice. Now, justice here is not meant in terms of courts and the law. Justice here means justice in terms of human relationships, what we call social justice. I do find this split of charity and justice and the dividing up of the agents of responsibility not necessarily in an enhancement of either justice and charity or a definition of how the Church is to think of its role in the world. I could be wrong because I just don't know enough about this topic, but it sounds a bit Lutheran to me to give the state the function of justice and the Church the function of charity, and it tends possibly to diminish the role of the Church in terms of its advocacy of justice as well as its work of charity. So I think we've still got to watch this. This is a first cut, and at least this is my first impression of it. I turn to the Regensburg speech. I normally would not. The question is, why include that here? It is not simply that it has attracted a great deal of attention. I have a different reason, and that is the following. I said earlier that I don't think this will be anywhere near as political a papacy as John Paul II's was. Now, John Paul II resisted the notion that his was a political papacy, but outsiders at least have a right to comment. If you look at his life and what he did and what he was involved in and how he will be ranked in secular history, this is not a monk. This is a person that played a major role in the second half of the 20th century and did it in very, very significant terms with secular impact. I fully agree with him that he did it according to Gaudium et Spes. He pursued the direct work of the Church, how the Church is to serve the kingdom. But the kingdom is a broadly defined reality, and so he served the kingdom in a way that made a difference in the world. I think the direct engagement will be less. I could be wrong, obviously, but I think it'll be less. But I do think that Benedict XVI may well approach the Vatican's role in world affairs, and particularly the question of religion and world politics. I do think he will approach it, or has the potential to approach it, through relationships with the great religious traditions. In other words, my secular colleagues who study world politics and with whom I spend a lot of time aren't quite sure what to do with this question of religion. They frankly have never gone near it, and they aren't particularly anxious to do so. But on the other hand, they're very apprehensive about the impact of religion on world politics in light of the fact that religion, as it engages the political, can always be either a benefit or a harm. And generally speaking, I think they're more concerned about the harm. Religion can open us to others, can find common ground with others, can encourage us to go the extra mile for others. Religion can also teach people why they should kill other people because they don't worship or don't see the world the way a given group sees it. So my secular friends worry about this topic and how we are going to manage religion and world politics. I do think that Benedict XVI has both the background, the skills, the knowledge, and the instinctive ability to relate to the great religious traditions in a way that could be extraordinarily helpful. I also think, purely speculative, that he has a chance, if his health is good, he has a much better chance than John Paul II did to make visits to Russia and to the People's Republic of China. The Russian Orthodox were not going to let John Paul II in the door. It was simply beyond the question. They saw what happened in Poland. And so that was just not going to happen. Benedict XVI is less threatening. And the cultivation of relationships with the People's Republic of China, which is a complex reality that goes on in the deep underground, is going on. And once again, I think he might be the kind of pope that, in a sense, I suppose this is not the best way to put it, but a less threatening reality to enter a communist society or a society emerging from communism. So, his relationship with the great religious traditions I see as an opportunity and a potential contribution, and then the two specific diplomatic dimensions of Russia and the PRC. That still leaves you with the Regensburg talk. And again, it has been analyzed in multiple ways. I'm not terribly sure I'll provide any value added here. But my sense of the talk was the following. First of all, it was a very, very expansive talk for a very short time. So that always leaves open the question that you might not get it exactly right. Secondly, in my view, there were three audiences for the talk. First of all, Catholics. Secondly, Western secular society, particularly academic society, and then thirdly, Islam. The first two audiences got quite substantial attention as he discussed faith and reason. His basic theme, cutting across all three audiences, as I read it, were the following. Reason without religion is a stunted vision of human life, the human person, and human affairs. Religion without reason is dangerous, especially when you're in situations of conflict. I think his argument was that straightforward. He wanted to make a critique of a certain conception of society and knowledge that argued that in order to enhance and reach the full development of reason, you need to banish religion because it will be an obstacle. He stood against that. He also wanted to stand against the conception of a religious tradition that is not open, if it is not open to critique, and highlight the fact that it can be dangerous. I'm not sure of what the future possibilities are. I think it's a little harder to envision my proposal now, but I think that it is still possible that his approach to the great world religions can be a significant contribution to the world as we know it. What has he done? His pastoral visits have been purely pastoral. They have lacked the politically significant edge of John Paul II. Once again, it is early on. The context of the places he has visited have not been politically laden, and he, I think by choice, has had a more low-keyed approach when he went in and out of places. The visit to Turkey, obviously, will be politically and religiously laden, and the question of how it will work, both vis-a-vis the Orthodox and the Turkish secular state, will be very interesting. I think the other thing that he's done or is doing that needs some concern or some attention as we look at his contribution to the social ministry is the question of personnel. There's nothing more important than what a pope or any major leader does than the choice of people that surround him, because that gives him a chance to be a strong leader, or her a chance to be a strong leader, and it then allows your views to be tested, measured, and criticized by others. I think he needs strong people in the Secretariat of State. He is not a person that comes to this post of the papacy with the kind of background of other popes. Pius XII was chosen in the first day of the election of the pontificate in 1939 precisely because he was a diplomat and World War II was on the cusp of the horizon. Paul VI was chosen for many reasons, but he was a lifelong diplomat. John Paul II was not a lifelong diplomat, but he was a bishop who had been hardened in political conflict with an adversarial state, and so there was nothing he didn't know about the church and politics. Benedict XVI comes to the papacy with none of these backgrounds, either experiential or training. And therefore, the strength of the Secretariat of State, I think, will be a very important choice. His choice is Cardinal Bertone as Secretary of State, a man who also has virtually no background in foreign policy or international relations, does not emerge from the diplomatic corps, and therefore the second spot, a position that's just been filled by a new person who is very skilled and is indeed an Islamicist by background, is a very important choice. But I just don't think that the Secretary of State is going to be where Benedict XVI's major attention is going to be. But the Vatican can't drop out of world affairs. So what he has there and who conducts it and in what way, there is a set of expectations about the Vatican that it would be unfortunate if they weren't fulfilled, namely an engaged participant in the world. He's going to need help to do that. How will he lead? He often talks about a small church, a small faithful church. And obviously, fidelity is a mark that the church always must be concerned about. But a small church by intention has not been, I think, the character of Catholicism. We tend to be a large church. You get that way by baptizing infants. And so we don't know the quality of who we choose. And it is a distinguishing mark over against churches that don't baptize infants, but in fact wait to see what the quality of the personnel is. But it isn't purely a personal question, it's a question about how the church sees again its relationship with the world. And Gaudium et Spes is a large church model. It is a large church model where we engage the secular on many fronts. So while I think his call for a small church in qualitative terms is understandable, I'm not at all sure that one ought to take that too far, or else one, I think, will run up against at least what has been, seems to me, the dominant tradition in Catholicism. There is no question, I think, that the primacy of faith over what you might call a politically active conception of the Vatican, the primacy of faith and spirituality and worship and articulation of doctrine will be his dominant contribution. I also think he'll contribute from what he is. He's a professor of 40 years, very good at it. John Paul II was a professor, but he was other things besides a professor, and those other things became at least as important. I suspect for Benedict XVI, my judgment is that the professorial tone, a teaching papacy, will be his primary role. Finally, implications of both of these different leaders and their engagement with the social ministry for the Church in the United States. These are quick comments. Here, when you look at the relationship of the universal church and the local church, obviously as Catholics we are led by, influenced by, inspired by, instructed by, sometimes confused by the universal church. But the local church has its own resources within the wider framework of the universal. And so we have our own conditions to face, our own context of the world to face, and we have our own specific questions that we must address. If you think of the social ministry of the Church, I suppose the first question about the leadership of both popes is the posture of the Church, what our posture is in this culture. I described the context for both popes. When I'm asked to describe the context of the United States, I usually say we face a secular state, a religiously and morally pluralistic society, a capitalist economy, and the role of a global power. That's who we are. Those major characteristics become the reference points in light of which we are called to witness to the social teaching. Now, that sort of is the externality of our life. The internal fabric is the pastoral life of the church and the quality of the church's faith. That is, in the church in the United States today, a complex relationship. That is to say, we have been through what anybody must describe and continue to go through, in many ways, a shattering pastoral experience through the sexual abuse crisis. And I do think that there's no question that it has significantly impacted the public life of American Catholicism. It is harder for us today to get space in the public arena. It is harder for us to be seen as a major player in the public arena. There are all kinds of small signs about this. Look at when the major media outlets do a religious topic and watch what faiths and groups are represented there. There was a major presentation over at the Kennedy Library sometime this fall. I noticed it was about religion in the United States. There was no Catholic voice at all. This is not to highlight the Kennedy Library. I'm really talking about major conceptions of who is playing an active role in the society. We've got a paradoxical situation. The social tradition that I have not in any way summarized, but simply outlined in the teaching of these two popes, is an articulated, substantial, quite respectable conception of how you relate religion to the world. Indeed, some of the other religious players who are more visible today oftentimes comment on the resources that exist in the Catholic tradition. And so what we should be is in my view, a Gaudium et Spes church. That is to say, a church in the midst of the world, sure of its identity, a church that, in my view, tries to capture the style of Gaudium et Spes, which is confident modesty, a conviction that we've got something to teach and share with the world, and that we've got something to learn from the world. That kind of engaged, visible church, public church, if you will, is, I think, what we should be. Empirically, at the minute, we have a hard time doing that. And so it isn't simply a matter of doing what we always did. We need to rebuild in the road ahead. There are signs out there that worry me. There is a significant effort because of money ahead, it would seem, to cut back the National Bishops' Conference. That strikes me because I worked there 20 years, but it mainly strikes me because in a country as large as this, you need national leadership if you're going to have a national voice. And if you cut that capacity back, you simply will sacrifice your ability to do that. So I worry about, at the very time when we face a significant challenge, we're not looking to all the instrumentalities that it will take to play the role we should take. Finally, our relationship to the culture and American society, there are two different points here that are important. One, our institutions, and two, citizens of faith. Our institutions still are without parallel in the rest of the religious community in the United States. This is a church that in some form or other sponsors the largest private school system in the country, the largest nonprofit healthcare system in the country, and the largest social service network in the country. So when the country is worried about how you care for the hungry, take care of children and families, care for the sick, and provide education for the young, we do that every day in literally hundreds, indeed thousands of institutions. Those institutions are still there. They are still doing what they have done. They face some complex questions on the church-state front, a topic for another lecture in itself, but it is one of the things that makes it harder for us to play the public role, because we've got some challenges that weren't there in the past. Finally, citizens of faith. While we're not as visible as I'd like as a public church, there is no question about the centrality of Catholics in the political life of the United States. In every election, we are the swing vote, if you will. I don't think that is a great criterion by which you judge a church, but it is important to know that we are that swing vote. I was on a panel at Harvard 2 weeks before the presidential election, and a pollster said, "I'll tell you who the undecided voter is. The undecided voter is a 51-year-old white woman who lives in Ohio and is Catholic." That is the swing vote in the election. And it tends to be true in election after election. But in a much broader sense, in a university like this, universities like this have sent out into the American public in every dimension of its life, the professions, the financial community, the political community, the media community, Catholics who are now major participants in those aspects of American life. So it isn't simply that we're a swing vote, we're a pervasive force de facto throughout the society. The question is how well we play that role and whether we really are leaven in the loaf or just part of the loaf. That's probably a good way to finish this. Thank you very much.